and or a vision, and we had some animals, some really strange-looking animals, and we're going to get the same thing tonight. We're going to get another vision by Daniel, and we're going to get some animals, maybe not quite as strange-looking animals as what we had in chapter 7, but not ordinary animals as well. Now, when we looked at chapter 7, we noticed something about that chapter 7 was very similar to another dream that occurred when? Chapter 2, right? And it involved not animals, it involved this strange statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had seen. And we had talked about when we covered chapter 2 that these different sections of the statue stood for what? Different what? Kingdoms, different nations, different kingdoms, ultimately culminating in the kingdom of Christ, right? The coming of Christ and establishment of His kingdom. And then when we kind of laid the vision of the animals on top of this vision of chapter 2, so we laid the vision of chapter 7 on the vision of chapter 2, what did we notice about that? That the same nations that were being discussed in chapter 2 were also the nations of chapter 7. Now, they use different things. You know, in chapter 2, the vision is about a statue with different sections of the statue. In chapter 7, you have different animals. You have a lion and bears and leopards and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, yeah. But we looked, as we saw that, they seemed to line up. And so we said, hey, it seems as though what we have are two visions describing roughly the same thing, which is a series of kingdoms that will arise in history, ultimately culminating in the rise of this final evil nation, and then its defeat and the coming of Christ and the establishment of His kingdom. All right, so let's kind of bear that in mind. So we've seen these two visions now that seem to line up. So we're going to get to chapter 8. Might it be that the vision of chapter 8 might line up with the other two? Maybe, right? Maybe. Let's take a look and see. All right. So let's begin, and we're just going to cover about half the chapter tonight because there's so much to talk about tonight that I don't want to rush through it. So we're going to just try to get through about 12 verses tonight. All right. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Now, this automatically, when we read that, tells us that this is taking place in what kingdom, in the reign of what empire? Babylon, that's right. So, again, this is not laid out necessarily chronologically because we've already had, the handwriting on the wall, which was the fall of the Babylonian Empire, and then chapter 6, Daniel in the Lion's Den, is in the time of the Medes and Persians, okay? But now we're backtrack. Chapter 7 backtrack. It was in Belshazzar's reign as well. It was if you look at 7, in the 1st year of Belshazzar's reign. So in chapter 8, we're 2 years past that. So we're the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, Babylon, all right? A vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. In other words, he's saying, I had this vision just like, very similar to what I had, 2 years prior that we read about in chapter 7. Verse 2, I saw in this vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Okay, now, here's the $100 question for the evening. Is it true or false that scholars in general agree on the interpretation of this prophecy? Well, you got a 50-50 chance of getting it right. So what do you think? Actually, it's true, and that's good for us. It's true. That's good for us because if most of the smart people that have spent their life, devoted their life, writing theologians, if most of them agree, then that means that we've got a pretty good idea of what it means. All right. Like I told you last time, one of my professors at seminary said, if you come up with an interpretation of the Bible that no one else has ever thought of, chances are you're wrong. All right. So we don't want to be the guy out in left field that, I'm coming up with brand new interpretations of the Bible. That's not where we want to be, because that probably means we're wrong. That's kind of how cults get started, Somebody buys a compound in Waco and moves a bunch of people in, and he comes up with all these new interpretations of scriptures that are 2,000 years old. All right, we don't want to be there. We want to be where learned men that have devoted their life to studying the Bible and understanding the Bible, if most of them are agreeing that it means one thing, then we don't want to be over here believing it to be something else, all right? I don't mean that you just take what a man says without any kind of discerning spirit. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying that if most scholars agree on this, then we're on pretty solid footing. If we come to the same conclusions, we're on pretty solid footing. All right. So, true or false, this vision took place before the events of chapter 5. What? Oh, let's see now. Chapter 5, let's go to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is, can't find 5. There it is. So, this is about the handwriting on the wall, which marks the end of Belshazzar's reign and the end of the Babylonian Empire, because that night, Babylon falls to the Medes and Persians, right? Okay, so chapter 8 is in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So is it before or after chapter 5? It's before. So it is true that it takes place before. And again, it just points back to what I was saying. These aren't necessarily in chronological order. So it's important to remember that as we go through, because if you're trying to force them into some sort of chronological thing, you've already missed the understanding of it. So, do what? Well, yeah, because, so in fact, chapter 5, you have the handwriting on the wall. That night, the kingdom falls. Belshazzar, the king, his kingdom falls. This is in the 3rd year. So this is going to take place about 550 BC, the events of chapter 8. It's before the fall of Babylon. It's about 2 years after the vision of chapter 7, because chapter 7 is the 1st year of Belshazzar's reign. This is the 3rd year. So we're dealing with roughly 2 years after the events of chapter 7, but before the events of chapter 5. All right? So let's talk about this ram that Daniel sees. So Daniel sees this vision, and in this is this ram. And this ram has 2 long horns. Nothing about that seems unusual yet, right? One is longer than the other, and grew up after the other. He says, verse 3, standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns. The 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So 2 horns, but one's bigger than the other. One comes up after the other. Then he's described as charging toward the north and the west and the south, and no one could stand against him. All right, so what in the world might this ram mean? Now, don't look in the back yet, and don't look at your Bible, your study Bible footnotes or anything like that. Don't cheat like that yet. Any ideas just off the top of your head what it might be? The Medes and the Persians, and you didn't cheat to get that, did you? All right, good deal. You've read this before, hadn't you? It's the Medes and the Persians. All right. Now, how do I know? How can we be sure about that? All right. Well, and I've done a good job of telling you don't read ahead. Don't. But tonight we're going to read ahead. Okay. We're going to read ahead. So as we get into verse 15, 16, in there, Daniel is disturbed because he's had this vision. He doesn't understand what it means. And so basically God tells Gabriel, the angel, says, give the understanding to Daniel. Tell him what it means, basically. Now look at verse 20. So this is good. We don't have to guess. I love these kind of prophecies where there's no guesswork involved. All right, look at verse 20. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. So we've got the first piece of the puzzle. Now, did we have something in the vision from chapter 7 that lined up with the Medes and the Persians? We did, didn't we? And did we have something from chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue that lined up with the Medes and the Persians? We did, didn't we? So, hey, maybe it's fallen in where it's going to line up with these other visions, or at least part of it will, right? Okay. Phil, let's see our first visual aid here. All right, now you may look at your little sheet back here, but let's just look at, don't look at the one on the far right. Let's just deal with the ram first, okay? So I'll get mine out here too. So in the vision of chapter 2 of the statue, what part of the statue lines up with the Medes and the Persians? The chests made of silver, right? And in chapter 7, it's represented as an animal, and the animal is what? The bear, all right? Now we get another animal, but we don't have a silver chest, and we don't have a bear. We have what? A ram with two horns. And yet we're told specifically this is the Medes and the Persians. So we don't have to guess. So this locks in the first part of the puzzle for us. These three things are the same, all right? So that helps us. That gets us started. In these kind of visions where you have symbols representing nations and kingdoms, you have to know the starting point if you're going to figure it out. So in chapter 2, the Nebuchadnezzar is told, you are the head of gold. So we know to start with Babylon. Here we're told we're starting with the Medes and Persians. Now this is an amazing thing, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I want you to think about why that is so amazing, this prophecy of the Medes and the Persians coming to power. Now, why two horns? Medes, Persians, one grows up after the other and outgrows the other. So Persia Medes first, Persia. Persia becomes the kingdom of record, the kingdom of power there. That's the idea there, okay? Now, so what is so remarkable about this prophecy of the Medes and the Persians? Who's in power when Daniel has this vision? Babylon. Is the Medes and the Persians, are they before Babylon or after Babylon? After. You see, are you getting the significance of this? That we have a Bible prophecy here that not only says that the most powerful nation in the world, Babylon, will fall, but even names the nation that it will fall to. I mean, how amazing is that? I mean, that's, God called his shot, so to speak. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, the Babylon, the greatest nation, it would be like saying, and maybe even more so, like saying, well, America, the most powerful nation in the world, will fall to a foreign power. Well, I mean, we'd be shocked. We have the most powerful military in the world. But what if the prophecy also said it will fall to X nation? It will fall to Russia. It will fall to France. It will fall to China. It will fall to Canada. All those rogue Canadians, So this is an amazing thing. This is the part of Bible prophecy that really gets me excited, because these are things that no one could have known until it happened, except God knew, and he revealed it to his prophet. All right? Questions on those first 4 verses? All right, that's just one little part of the vision. It goes on from there. So let's pick up verse 5. I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, so let's see if we can describe this. Okay, put my other picture up here, my other visual aid here. All right. See, I could have tried to draw that for you. But I thought this would be easier, so I just put that up there. Debbie Ward came in the office and saw that laying out, and she said, "Are you going to be talking about unicorns on Wednesday night?" So it's not a unicorn, it's a one-horned goat. It's like that song. What is that? I was like, one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eater. Well, it's not a purple people eater. It's just a one-eyed. It's just a one-horned goat. I don't guess it has 2 eyes. I don't know. All right, so let's talk about this. So basically, this goat has 1 horn between his eyes. It comes from the west. It attacks with great rage and speed. And then what happens to this large horn? Broken off. And then in place of this large horn that's broken off, what happens? 4 horns come up in its place. 4 horns come up in its place. All right. Now, let's think back to chapter 7's vision. We had 10 horns, so that's not going to add up. But did we have something that was 4? We had a lion, we had a bear. What did we have next? A leopard. And the leopard had how many horns? What? Heads, not horns. Leave it to the preacher's wife to get me messed up. Four heads. All right, y'all know what I meant, right? You knew what I was trying to say. 4 heads is what I'm trying to say, all right? Now, the bear was the Medes and Persians, and it lined up with the ram as the Medes and Persians, and then the leopard had 4 heads, and it came after the bear, and this goat that comes up ends up with 4 horns, and it comes after the ram. Do you think maybe those might coincide? Good chance of it, right? Good chance of it. All right. So let's take a look and see. So let's see. Now look at your little thing out here. All right. So in chapter 2, the vision of the statue, the hips, that's not what he calls it. The next section, the hips, I guess that doesn't sound right, but anyway, the hips of brass, and the 4-headed leopard is what? Grease. So we would expect this goat to be what? Grease. If we're on the right track, then, and we're following the right pattern on this, then this thing should be grease, right? Do we have any way of knowing? We're going to read ahead again, what I told you not to do before, but we're going to do it tonight. Verse 21, and the male goat is the kingdom of, hey, we're on the right track, right? We got it going our way. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. Who would that be? Alexander the Great. Here's where you got to know a little bit of world history, all right? Every good student of the Bible needs to learn a little bit of world history. So you may hate it, you may not want to, but you've got to have a little bit of a cursory understanding of it to understand fully what's going on. Alexander the Great. Okay, so look at what is in the vision. The male goat gets very strong. When he becomes strong, the large horn is broken off. And notice he's attacking the ram. He attacks the ram, verse 7, breaks the 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to withstand him and cast down. It's talking about how Greece how the Medes and the Persians fall to Alexander the Great. And then, in the height of power, the horn is broken off. What do you think that means? Alexander the Great died. Died as a young man, at height of power, dies. And then the 4 horns, look at verse 22. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So you have the 4, Alexander the Great's kingdom on his death is divided among his 4 generals. That's the idea of the 4 heads on the leopard. It's also the idea of the 4 horns on the goat that comes up out of the big horn. Make sense? And again, if you didn't know a little bit of world history, you'd miss that. You wouldn't get that. A little bit of world history helps you with your Bible study. All right? So, any questions on that? All right. That pretty much is locked down, locked solid. I don't know that any reputable scholar that would really disagree with that part of it. Now we get to the next part of it, and there may be a little more disagreement. All right? So let's look at this again. We got to read. We didn't. Yeah, we're to verse 9. Let's read verse 9 through 12. Out of one of them, that's significant, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Okay, so out of these four horns, out of one of them grows this other horn, all right? It starts small, but it becomes great. Throws the stars to the ground and tramples them. We'll talk about what some of this means in a minute. He exalts himself as God, or as the vision is explained as above the Prince of Hosts, but the idea is there as over God. And he abolishes sacrifices and truth. Okay. Now, here we go to the question that's going to really be our big question to answer for the night. I'm going to get somebody on this, maybe not, hope not. Who is the little horn? Y'all, I've scared you so much you're not even going to attempt an answer. Just off the top of your head, without me scaring you or looking at Bible study notes or anything like that, knowing what we've already read about these little horns that grow up and all this, what do you think it might be? Rome, or... So in chapter 7, the little horn was what? Antichrist, that's right, Antichrist. So you would think maybe the little horn here is the Antichrist? Maybe. How about if I give you this answer? Yes and no. How about that? Yes and no. And again, you've heard me say this before. In Bible prophecy, there is this element of already and what? Not yet. Here we're going to see that again. We have an already and a not yet. So this little horn, most scholars, and that's significant, we don't want to be out here in left field. We want to be where most conservative, Bible-believing scholars are, and they, for the most part, agree that this little horn is a reference to whom? This really weird dude, Antiochus Epiphanes. All right, let me spell that for you. Antiochus, like Antioch. Antiochus Epiphanes, Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, who was Antiochus Epiphanes? Okay, he grew out of this Seleucid Empire, okay? And that is Seleucid, Seleucid. Seleucid, Seleucid Empire. Okay, so that's what you get out of this. That's why it's coming out of one horn. I put our visual, the one that has all three chapters, Phil. There we go. Okay, so if you look at your little deal, you've got four horns, and we kind of put a little Oklahoma engineering on this chart because they had these lined up like under the goat. All right, but I said it really doesn't, because it's not Rome. It's not a reference to Rome. So I actually, Phil and I kind of worked to bring that out and put it up beside the goat rather than underneath the goat, because it's coming out of what's left of the Greek Empire. And so, as I told you, it's divided into these, between the four generals of Alexander the Great, and out of this comes this Seleucid Empire. And out of the one horn, out of this one kingdom, you get this ruler that was terrible. He was awful, okay? He slaughtered a pig on the altar of the Jewish temple. He put up a statue of Zeus, an altar to Zeus, and made everybody fall down and worship him. He was terrible. He desecrated the temple, and in fact, during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there was this Jewish revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes. He was so horrible, and it was led by a group of Jews led by Judas Maccabeus. Again, you need to know a little bit of history to help you with this. And they miraculously retake they defeat Antiochus's forces. They retake the temple. Then they have to cleanse the temple. All right, and to cleanse the temple, the lamps must burn continually for like 7 days or 8 days, 7 or 8 days. But there's only like one bottle of oil in there, and so they use that one bottle of oil, and miraculously the light burns continually for all of the days necessary for the cleansing of the temple. And the Jews to this day celebrate this miraculous event of the cleansing of the temple, and they call it what? Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights. But it was this Antiochus Epiphanes, this horrible guy that they defeated in all of that. So this is the little horn that waxed great out of the one horn, Antiochus Epiphanes of this Seleucid Empire. Now, if you look in verse 9, out of this little horn, which grows exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. Where's the glorious land? Israel, Holy Land, Palestine, right. Now, he talks about the trampling of the stars. Verse 10, grew up to the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. What do you think this might be a reference to? To what? God, yeah, God's people. I think so. A persecution of God's people seems to be the idea there. And then let's look at one other little thing here. Verse 11, he exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. We said that was a reference to God. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So what do you think that is in reference to? Remember the story I just told you about what Antiochus Epiphanes did and what Judas Maccabeus did. So the sanctuary being cast down, what do you think that's a reference to there? Yeah, the desecration of the temple, probably. And if you notice, I don't know what your translation you're using. I'm in New King James, and the phrase "his sanctuary," in my translation, the "his" is capitalized. Is the "his" in your translation capitalized? That means the translators of the Bible, of your version of the Bible anyway, understood that to be a reference to God's sanctuary. So that would be the temple there. All right, questions on that? Antiochus Epiphanes? I'm so glad you asked that question. Yeah, I do. I think there is a correlation. So here's what I believe. You know, I told you before there are types and shadows, all right? Types and shadows. So I believe that Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist, all right? So let's flip your page there I'm giving you for further consideration. This is basically the same question that you just asked. Compare the vision of the little horn in the vision of chapter 7 that we identified last time as the Antichrist with the vision of the little horn in chapter 8 that we've tonight identified as Antiochus Epiphanes. They appear to be almost identical descriptions, yet they apparently refer to different characters, different kingdoms, and different time periods. What do you make of this? Okay, so let me say this. First of all, what you make of it will depend largely on your millennial viewpoint and your approach to interpreting eschatology or end times, last things. Now, some of you may say, I don't know if I have a millennial viewpoint. That may be the best. I mean, that may be the best of all. We've got a clean slate to start with, all right? But if you come at this from more of say an amillennial viewpoint, you're probably going to say that they both refer to Antiochus Epiphanes, that it's just all historic, it's just a reference to the history of it. That, this idea of the Antichrist, there have been types of Antichrist all along, and, Jesus will come back one day and that'll be it, If you maybe take a different, I'm not even going to say premillennial, but maybe a certain type of premillennial viewpoint, perhaps you see it more that they both refer to the Antichrist, that, this is all out there. So there's no Antiochus in the middle of it. It's just all the Antichrist. But as I said, and I think most conservative scholars would come down this way, there is an already and a not yet aspect to many prophecies. For instance, the first and second coming of Christ. In many Old Testament prophecies, when the prophets spoke of the coming of Christ, it was seen as one event. And so that's why the Jews of Jesus' day couldn't figure out, how can he be both the lion and the lamb? How can he be, Son of God and Son of Man? How can he be, the King of Kings and the suffering servant? It didn't make sense because they didn't understand that it was two separate events tied to the coming of Christ. There was when Jesus was born in Bethlehem and died on the cross, there was an already aspect of the coming of Christ, and there's still a not yet, because we know he's coming again. We see in the Old Testament, David is put forth as a type of Christ. A lot of the Psalms that David writes find their ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, although he writes it about his own life and his own experiences. So if this is true, and we're looking at an already and not yet, it's best to see Antiochus Epiphanes as a type and a foreshadowing of the Antichrist. Let me give you another type and foreshadowing of the Antichrist that might relate better to you because it was not that long ago. Let's see. This is 2020. So about 80, a little over 80 years ago, a guy rises to power in Germany, and his name was, now you get this, all right, you look at this. Here's a guy that comes to power. He marches under the banner of a broken cross. He persecutes the Jews, puts them to death. He's allied with Mussolini, who is the leader of the revived Roman Empire, and the emperor of Japan, who proclaims himself to be God. And the war ends in this cataclysmic event that is what we call an atomic bomb. But if you read some of the descriptions of how Armageddon ends, it sounds like it's almost exactly the same thing. if I were alive in those days, I would have been convinced the end was upon us. But Hitler wasn't the Antichrist, but he was a type of Antichrist. And so by looking at Hitler, we get a little glimpse in what the full and final revelation of the Antichrist will be. Does that make sense? Okay. Antiochus Epiphanes sets himself up to be God. He desecrates the temple. He ends the daily sacrifices. He slaughters a pig on the altar of the Jews. I mean, if maybe if you were alive in those days, you might say, well, surely this is the end. But and here's the deal: to the Jews, if you spoke about the abomination of desolation, they thought you were talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what they would have gone to. However, when Jesus in Matthew 24 is speaking about the signs of the end, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not, that Daniel spoke of, let the reader understand. He's not talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. He's talking about some future event. But he understands that Antiochus Epiphanes becomes a type of Antichrist, which tells us that if we want to know a little more about what the full and final revelation of the Antichrist will be, look at the type and shadow in Antiochus Epiphanes. That makes sense? Now look at the last little page that I gave you. And let me find mine. So that's exactly what this kind of sums up here. The little horns of 7 and 8, all right? So in so the little horn of chapter 7 is the Antichrist, comes, at the end of the Fourth Empire, or the revived Roman Empire. He's the 11th horn. He persecutes God's people. And then the little horn of chapter 8, Antiochus Epiphanes, he comes from Greece, the third kingdom. He's the 5th horn, coming out of one of the 4 horns of Alexander's kingdom. He persecutes God's people and has the power to persecute for 2,300 days. We'll look at that next time. That's all in the second part of chapter 8. Now look at the Antichrist. The 11th horn becomes the 8th by uprooting 3 of the 10. Eventually rule the world, will seize the rebuilt Jewish temple, will proclaim himself to be God, demand the whole world worship him and his father, the devil, prosper and nothing will stand in his way, rejects the God of his fathers. Now look at the type of Antichrist, the type and shadow in Antiochus Epiphanes. 4 horns represent Alexander's broken empire after his death. Could include Syria and Egypt. Antiochus rises to become the 8th king of Syria, stated to be a vile person. In 168 BC, was forced to go back to Rome in his quest to take the city of Alexandria. Vented his fury on Jerusalem. That's what I was telling you about, the incident of the desecration of the temple. Had previously sacrificed a pig on the altar, attacks the Jews on the Sabbath day, ordered all Jewish ceremonies and sacrifices to cease, copies of Scripture destroyed, erected an idol altar in the temple with the image of Zeus, and become known by the Jews as the abomination of desolation. You notice a common theme here. Persecution of God's people it accompanies all of these types of Antichrist. All right? So if you want to know, well, what can I expect from the Antichrist? That's one of the things that seems to be common, persecution of God's people. Now, in the Old Testament, it was the Jews. And in Nazi Germany, it was the Jews. But it was also Christians to some extent. In the full and final revelation of the Antichrist, will it be the Jews? Well, yeah, but it'll be the true Jews. It will be the Christians, right? It'll be God's people, because who are God's people now? Who are God's people now? We are. So it is the persecution of God's people, but don't get hung up on this idea of the ethnic Jews. Persecution of God's people will be God's people. All right. So Antiochus Epiphanes becomes a type of Antichrist, as the Emperor Caesar Nero in Rome became, but also, Adolf Hitler in our own time becomes. So, types and shadows that point to the full and final revelation. Questions? Comments? Clear as mud, huh? Are you getting it? I mean, is it making sense to you? All right, cool. All right, well, next week you got Phil and James, and then I'll be back the following Wednesday, and we'll pick up with the back half of chapter 8. All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Thank you.